The silence in the Vance residence was a feature, not a bug. It was a clean, sterile quiet, optimized for focus, the kind that filled the minimalist spaces between polished concrete and floor-to-ceiling glass in his Silicon Valley home. Ethan Vance, its architect in both a literal and figurative sense, preferred the lack of noisy data. Silence had become his most stable operating system for the past few years. That afternoon, like a recursive loop, Ethan firewalled himself inside his home office. The sleek chrome, the monitors displaying stock tickers he didn't care about, the holographic family photos he'd programmed to stay dormant. It was his sandbox environment against the chaotic code of life that continued executing relentlessly outside while his had crashed exactly 2 years, 3 months, and 12 days ago. Outside the panoramic window, the sky over Palo Alto was the color of unpolished slate, threatening a system-wide downpour. Ethan saw a strange parallel in the heavy clouds. Both were overloaded with unsent data packets that would eventually have to be released. The clouds, at least, had a protocol for it. He did not. Mr. Vance, Maria's voice, a familiar but intrusive audio input, cut through his thoughts. The company reports just arrived and Mrs. Wilson called again about the babies. Ethan didn't pivot his chair. He waved a dismissive hand, a gesture meant to close both the program and any queries related to his children. Children? The word was an alien variable, a foreign key in his database. He'd never processed them as his, only as living, breathing data points of Chloe, painful reminders that cried and required an API he didn't possess or refused to access. Leave the reports on the desk. As for the babies, Mrs. Wilson knows what to do. Maria hesitated at the door, a predictable pause in her script whenever the twins were the subject. Ethan could feel her silent disapproval, a packet of emotional data he chose to drop. He didn't care. No one had the access key. No one could understand. "They're starting to babble a few words, sir. I thought you might like to know." When Ethan gave no response, a null value, Maria sighed and closed the door with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine. He remained static, staring at a blank monitor. It wasn't the first data point he'd received about the twins' development. He had already missed the first smile, the first tooth, the first crawl, and now the first words. But how could he look at them without seeing Chloe's eyes in their code? How could he hold them knowing they were the reason she had logged off permanently? The clock on the wall was a digital display reading 3 p.m. In exactly 40 minutes, Ethan would leave for his meeting in the city. His routine was an algorithm meticulously designed to minimize his time at home. Between the office and frequent business trips, he managed to almost entirely avoid the reality that existed upstairs in the star and cloud-themed nursery, a server room he had never accessed. Across town, in a different part of the valley, where the gleam of tech campuses gave way to the grit of everyday life, the sky threatening a downpour wasn't Maya's primary concern. The 5-year-old with messy light hair and eyes that seemed to take up too much bandwidth on her small face was more worried about the error message her stomach was sending. It had been almost 2 days since her last proper meal, half a sandwich a kind lady had given her near the Caltrain station. Maya huddled under the awning of a closed coffee shop, watching people rush by, their faces buried in their phones, all ignoring the small, lone figure on the sidewalk. She didn't blame them. She had learned this was the default setting of the world. Some people were simply rendered invisible. When the rain finally began, it was like a network-wide command was issued. The streets emptied quickly, leaving Maya with an even weaker signal of connection to the world. Carefully, she picked up her only possession, a worn backpack containing a change of clothes and a one-armed rag doll, and decided to find a better node to shelter. The rain intensified as Maya walked, her small legs carrying her farther and farther from the commercial center. The houses grew larger, their lawns greener, their security systems more obvious. She knew she was in a restricted zone. Wealthy people didn't like bugs like her in their system. But the rain gave her no choice. That's when she saw the residence. It was set back from the others, partially hidden by a row of perfectly manicured cypress trees. What caught her attention wasn't its impressive architecture or intimidating beauty, but the side gate left slightly ajar, a clear security breach. Maya hesitated. Accessing private property was dangerous. She knew that from experience. But the rain was getting stronger, the cold penetrating her thin jacket, and her stomach ache was a critical level alert she could barely think past. Maybe there was a porch or a dry alcove where she could hide until the storm passed. Maybe, if she was very lucky, there would be discarded data, leftovers, in a trash can. The thought of food was the final push she needed. With one last glance around, Maya slipped through the gate and onto the property. The garden was huge and perfectly landscaped, the kind of place Maya had only seen in magazines or on TV screens. Hurrying to avoid detection, she made her way around the house, looking for a place to hide. That's when she noticed a side door, probably for service staff, that was also slightly open. Maya bit her lip, undecided. Entering the house was a much higher risk than just staying in the yard. But her clothes were soaked, and the smell of food wafting from inside was simply an irresistible data stream to someone who was starving. Just a quick peek, she thought, just to see if there's anything to eat. Heart pounding like an overloaded processor, Maya pushed the door open and stepped inside. The contrast between the cold outside and the climate-controlled warmth inside was almost shocking. Maya found herself in a service hallway with a corridor that seemed to lead to the kitchen. But before she could head that way, another sound caught her attention. A sound her brain took a few seconds to parse. Crying. The crying of babies. Maya froze, her hunger momentarily forgotten. She followed the sound, which grew clearer with each step. She climbed a side staircase, probably used by staff, and arrived at a wide, elegant hallway, starkly different from the entrance she had used. The crying came from a door left ajar at the end of the hallway. Cautiously, Maya approached and peeked through the gap. The room was lovely, painted in soft shades of blue and green, with star-shaped smart lights on the ceiling and shelves full of toys that seemed to have never been used. In the center of the room, side by side, were 2 cribs, and the crying came from both. Maya pushed the door open a bit more, entering the room silently. The babies, she could see now, they were 2 identical boys, were red-faced from crying so hard, their little legs kicking in frustration. Where is everyone? Maya thought, looking around. The room was empty except for the babies. No adult, no nanny in sight. For a moment, Maya forgot she was just a child trespassing in someone else's house. All she saw were 2 crying babies needing comfort, and if there was one thing Maya understood, it was how awful it felt to be alone and scared. "Hey, it's okay," she whispered, approaching the first crib. "Don't cry." The baby looked at her, startled by the unfamiliar voice, and his crying momentarily subsided. Encouraged, Maya reached out and gently touched his tummy. "Are you hungry? Or just sad?" she asked with the casualness of someone used to talking to the wind, since she rarely got responses. The second baby continued crying, so Maya moved over to the other crib. It was strange how they looked alike, like 2 duplicate files. After a moment's hesitation, she extended her arms and carefully picked up the baby, exactly as she had seen mothers do in the park. "Shh, it's okay," she murmured, rocking him gently. "I get sad too sometimes. It's not fun, right?" To her surprise, the baby calmed down in her arms, his sobs fading into small hiccups. Encouraged by her success, Sophie sat in a nearby armchair, still holding the baby, and stretched an arm toward the other crib. "Come on, you too," she said, managing to touch the other baby's little hand. "I won't leave you alone." Ethan left his meeting earlier than scheduled. The issue that seemed so urgent was resolved in less than an hour, leaving him with a block of unscheduled time he didn't know how to fill. Returning to the office was inefficient. Dining out alone was not appealing. And going back home. Home. The word was a deprecated term in his mind. The residence had ceased being a home the moment Chloe's vital signs flatlined. Now it was just a place where he slept and worked between carefully scheduled trips and meetings that kept his CPU occupied. When his driver, Kevin, asked where they should go, Ethan almost said, "Anywhere," but the words that came out were different. "Home, Kevin. I'm tired." The rain had slowed by the time they arrived at the property. Ethan immediately noticed something wrong. The side gate was ajar. Frowning, he instructed Kevin to check and properly secure the gate, a lapse in the security protocol he would address later. Entering the house through the main hall, Ethan was met by an unusual silence. Typically, Maria or one of the other staff would come to greet him, but no one was in sight. "Maria," he called, removing his damp coat. No one answered. Ethan checked his watch. 4:30 p.m. At this time, Maria was usually supervising dinner preparations. More intrigued than worried, Ethan headed upstairs to his room. Passing down the hall, he noticed something stranger still: complete silence coming from the twins' room. At this hour, he would normally hear the smart speaker playing some children's show Mrs. Wilson insisted on for the babies, or occasionally their crying. Ethan stopped in front of the door. He hadn't entered that room since the babies were brought home from the hospital. Maria had overseen the decor, hired the nanny, arranged everything. He signed the checks and ignored the weekly progress reports on the twins. It was easier that way. But now the silence bothered him. It was as if the house were holding its breath, waiting for a system crash. Hesitantly, Ethan pushed open the door to the nursery. The scene he found left him momentarily speechless. A girl, she couldn't have been more than 6, was sitting in the nursing armchair, holding one of the twins in her arms. The other baby was in his crib, no longer crying, calmly observing the stranger who had appeared in his room. The girl was soaked, her hair dripping water onto the light carpet, and she looked as comfortable as if she belonged there. "Who are you?" Ethan demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. "What are you doing in my house?" The girl raised her eyes, frightened. They were large, a deep shade of blue, standing out against her pale, thin face. For a moment, she seemed unable to speak, frozen like a program that had encountered a fatal error. I, she stammered, pressing the baby closer to herself as if to protect him. The door was open. It was raining, and they were crying. Ethan took a step forward, ready to grab his phone and call security, or maybe the police. But something made him pause. The way the girl held his son so carefully, with such tenderness. And the baby's eyes, usually so restless whenever Ethan chanced to glance, were calm, almost sleepy. "Where is Mrs. Wilson, the nanny?" he asked, trying to make sense of the situation. The girl shook her head. "There's no one here, just them, crying." Ethan felt a surge of anger. Mrs. Wilson had left the babies alone. That was unacceptable. But the anger was quickly replaced by another emotion when he realized for the first time he genuinely worried about the twins. Not about the logistics of their care, not about the reports on their development, but about them, about the fact that they had been left alone. He looked more closely at the girl. Her clothes were not just wet, but worn and a bit too small. Her face, despite her youth, had an expression Ethan recognized, someone carrying a burden far too heavy for her small shoulders. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone gentler now. "Sophie," she answered, still wary. "And what exactly are you doing here, Sophie?" The girl bit her lip, clearly torn about how much to reveal. "I was looking for somewhere to hide from the rain, and maybe—" she hesitated. "Maybe something to eat." The honesty of her response caught Ethan off guard. There was no attempt to lie or concoct a story, just the raw, unencrypted truth. A hungry child in need of shelter. "Where are your parents?" The question caused a visible change in Sophie. Her shoulders slumped a little, and her already large eyes seemed to grow even bigger. "My mom got sick, very sick. She went to sleep and never woke up." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. The simplicity with which Sophie described her mother's death was so direct it made the tragedy even more palpable. "And your father?" Sophie looked away, focusing on the baby in her arms. "He said he was going out to buy medicine for Mom, but he never came back. I waited a long time. Then the lady from the next apartment said I couldn't stay there anymore because no one was paying rent." Ethan felt something shift inside him, like ice cracking. This girl, this fragile child sitting in his home, had been abandoned, left to fend for herself in a world that even adults struggle to navigate. "How long ago was that, Sophie?" She shrugged, a gesture that seemed oddly adult in such a small body. "I don't know. Many days. A lot." Ethan walked to the window, needing a moment to process what he was hearing. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained gray and heavy. He turned back to look at Sophie, noticing how she held his son carefully, how her eyes stayed alert for any sign of distress from the baby. A child caring for another child. Ethan moved closer and sat on the edge of the armchair next to Sophie. For the first time, he truly looked at one of his children. The baby had his eyes, Ethan realized with a start. But the nose and the curve of the lips, they were Chloe. The thought didn't bring the usual pain, just a twinge of nostalgia. "Were they alone when you arrived?" he asked, indicating the twins. Sophie nodded. "They were crying a lot. I think they were scared." "And you weren't afraid? Of entering a stranger's house?" A small smile appeared on Sophie's lips. "I was, but they were crying so loudly. And I know what it's like when no one comes." The simplicity and depth of her answer hit Ethan like a punch. "I know what it's like when no one comes." How many times had the baby in his arms cried, calling for someone, for him, and no one had come? How many needs, how many fears had gone ignored because he was too busy hiding from his own pain? At that moment, a commotion from downstairs broke the silence. Agitated voices, hurried footsteps. The nursery door suddenly opened, revealing Maria, followed by Mrs. Wilson. Both stopped abruptly at the sight of Ethan sitting beside an unknown child who held one of the twins. "Mr. Vance!" Maria exclaimed, her expression a mix of surprise and relief. "We didn't expect you so soon. Mrs. Wilson had a family emergency and had to leave, but she was trying to contact the backup nanny service. I was at the grocery store getting the supplies you requested." Ethan looked at the two women, then at Sophie, and finally at the baby in his arms. His arms. "Emergency or not, my children were left alone," he said with a firmness that surprised everyone, including himself. "That's unacceptable." Mrs. Wilson turned pale. "Sir, I truly apologize. My sister had an accident, and I assumed Maria had already returned. I'd never do that intentionally." Ethan stood, making a decision even he didn't expect. "I understand emergencies happen, Mrs. Wilson, but I can't trust my children's care to someone who would leave them alone under any circumstances. Maria, please settle Mrs. Wilson's final payment." The two women stared at him, stunned. In 2 years, Ethan had never shown this much interest in the twins, and now, suddenly, he was making decisions about their care. Maria was the first to recover her composure. "Yes, sir, and about—" She looked at Sophie, who was watching everything with wide eyes, still holding the baby. Ethan turned to the girl. There was something about her, something that reminded him of himself at 5. Not her poverty or abandonment, but the determination in her eyes, the quiet strength. "Sophie, would you like a hot bath and something to eat?" The girl's face lit up with hope, but there was caution in her eyes too. Too much hope and fear for someone so young. "Can I? Really?" Ethan nodded. "Maria, prepare the guest room next to mine, and ask the kitchen for a hearty dinner. Sophie will stay with us tonight." Sophie looked at him, then at the baby in her arms, clearly reluctant to let go. Can I say goodbye to him first?" Ethan felt something break inside him. With a movement that seemed both strange and natural, he sat back down beside Sophie and opened his arms. "Actually, I think it's time for me to hold my son. Do you think he'll like that?" Sophie smiled, like a ray of sunshine on a cloudy day. "I think so. Support his little head, like this." Carefully, she transferred the baby into his father's arms. The little one fussed a bit, but soon settled, gazing at Ethan with curious eyes. "Hi," Ethan said, his voice softer than it had been in years. "I'm your dad." Sophie watched the scene approvingly, then stood and walked to the other crib. "Don't worry," she whispered to the second baby. "Your dad is here now, and I'm here too." Ethan observed her interaction, a certainty growing inside him. This girl, this child fate had brought to his door, had done in minutes what he had not managed in 2 years, tear down the walls he had built around his heart. "Maria," he called, without taking his eyes off Sophie. "Tomorrow I want you to contact my lawyer. We have important matters to discuss." "Yes, sir. About—" Ethan finally looked at his housekeeper, and there was a determination in his eyes she hadn't seen since before the tragedy. "About Sophie. She's staying." A week had passed since Sophie's arrival at the Vance residence, a week of system adjustments, of broken routines, of uncomfortable silences being filled with unexpected noise. Ethan walked through his own corridors like a stranger, always on alert, always expecting to run into the little intruder who had upended his orderly life. That morning, Ethan sat at the breakfast table with his tablet open in front of him, a wall of data between him and the rest of the world. But for the first time in years, the screen couldn't fully block out the sounds around him. "No, no," Sophie's voice came from the other side of the table. "You have to blow first. It's too hot." Ethan lowered the tablet a few inches, enough to peer over the top. Sophie was seated beside Maria, showing the housekeeper how to prepare cereal the right way. "See? That's better," the girl said, taking a spoonful with satisfaction. Maria smiled, the kind of genuine smile Ethan hadn't seen on her face in a long time, free of the layers of worry and pity she usually wore around him. "You're quite the teacher, Miss Sophie," Maria responded with a wink. Ethan raised the tablet again, trying to ignore the strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't exactly discomfort, nor irritation. It was something more complicated, harder to define, as if a variable were out of place and yet exactly where it should be. "Mr. Vance," Maria called, "would you like more coffee?" Ethan lowered the tablet once more, ready to respond with his usual polite refusal, when he noticed Sophie watching him with those large blue eyes. There was something in her gaze, a mix of curiosity and expectation, that made him feel exposed. "Yes, please," he replied, surprising both himself and Maria. As the housekeeper walked away to get the coffee pot, Sophie leaned over the table. "You work a lot, huh?" she asked, her eyes locked on him. Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the direct question. "Yes, I run a company." "What do you do?" "I build buildings, big projects in several cities." Sophie nodded as if that were the most fascinating thing in the world. "Is that why you never play with the babies?" The question hit Ethan hard, direct, without warning, without filter, the kind of question only a child would ask. "My work takes up a lot of time," he answered, his voice harsher than he intended. Sophie just stared at him for a few more seconds before turning her attention back to her cereal. But Ethan felt the weight of her gaze long after she had looked away. It was as if she could see through him, through the excuses and justifications he had built up over the years. Maria returned with the coffee, and while pouring it, leaned in slightly. "The social worker called again, sir. She needs your signature on some documents about Sophie's temporary guardianship, and your attorney sent the papers you requested." Ethan nodded. Over the past few days, he had been buried under a bureaucracy he had never imagined facing. His lawyer, Jessica Grant, seemed both surprised and worried by Ethan's sudden desire to take responsibility for a child he barely knew, but she worked diligently to make it happen. "I'll be at the office today. Have them send it there." Sophie lifted her eyes from her bowl. "You're leaving again?" There was something in that question, not an accusation, merely a statement of fact, that made Ethan uneasy. "I have important meetings," he explained, realizing how odd it felt to justify his schedule to a 5-year-old. Sophie just shrugged. "That's okay. I'll take care of the babies while you're gone." Ethan folded the newspaper carefully, trying to ignore the feeling of being replaced. The idea was absurd. He had never really been present in the twins' lives, so how could he be replaced? "The new nanny arrives today," he said in a neutral tone. "She'll take care of the twins." Sophie's face lit up. "Can I help her? I already know how they like to be rocked." Before Ethan could reply, Maria intervened. "Of course you can, dear. Miss Perez will be happy to have your help, I'm sure." Ethan stood, suddenly anxious to leave, to escape this domestic atmosphere that felt suffocating. This was not how his house was supposed to be, noisy, full of questions and expectations. "I'll be back for dinner," he announced, more out of habit than anything else. No one ever used to wait for him to have dinner. But as he reached the door, Sophie's voice stopped him. "I'll tell the babies you're coming back for dinner. They'll be happy." Ethan paused for a moment, absorbing those words. Then, without turning around, he continued on his way, carrying with him the image of 3 children waiting for his return. The office had always been his refuge, a place where the rules were clear, where numbers and projects replaced emotions and expectations. Ethan sat at his desk, the pile of documents Maria had mentioned already waiting for him. His assistant, Sam, walked in with the day's schedule. "Good morning, sir. We have a meeting with the Chinese investors at 10, lunch with the mayor at noon, and the board wants your input on the East Side project by the end of the day." Ethan nodded absently, his eyes on the documents about Sophie. Attached were photos. Sophie in a faded school uniform. Sophie with a woman who was probably her mother. Sophie alone, looking at the camera with those eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "Sir?" Sam sounded confused by his silence. "Is everything all right?" Ethan blinked, returning to the present moment. "Yes, just—" He made a vague gesture toward the documents. "Personal matters." Sam raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised. In 4 years working for Ethan, this was probably the first time he heard his boss mention anything personal. "I can postpone some appointments if you need time." Ethan considered the offer. Before, he would have immediately refused. His work always came first. But now, looking at the documents that would decide Sophie's future, he hesitated. "Keep the meeting with the investors, but reschedule lunch with the mayor. And for the board," he glanced at the clock, "tell them I'll send my comments by email tonight." Sam looked momentarily stunned, but recovered quickly. "Of course, sir. Anything else?" Ethan looked again at Sophie's photo. "Yes, I want to be home in time for dinner. Make sure there's nothing in the way." The day unfolded differently than usual. Ethan found himself checking the time more often, his mind wandering to the mansion, wondering what Sophie was doing, whether the new nanny had arrived, whether the twins were okay. Thoughts that had never occupied his work hours before. The meeting with the investors ended earlier than expected, leaving Ethan a few free hours before dinner. Instead of filling that time with more work, as he normally would, he found himself driving back home in the mid-afternoon, something he hadn't done in years. The mansion was oddly quiet when he entered. Ethan checked his watch. 4:30. Typically, at this hour, Maria would be overseeing dinner preparations, and the nanny would be with the twins in their room or the playroom. "Maria?" he called, placing his briefcase in the entry hall. No reply. Ethan climbed the stairs, a slight sense of concern forming. He was about to check the twins' room when he heard a sound coming from the garden. Laughter. Ethan headed to the back door and stopped, surprised by the scene. In the perfectly manicured lawn, Maria and a young woman he assumed was Miss Perez were sitting on a blanket spread across the grass. The twins in their strollers were beside them, and Sophie ran around, blowing soap bubbles that the new nanny created in the air. It was such a domestic, so normal picture that for a moment Ethan felt like an intruder in his own home. Sophie was the first to notice him. "Mr. Vance," she exclaimed, running toward him. You came back early." There was such genuine joy in her voice that Ethan didn't know how to respond, how to explain that he never did come back early, that he was actually breaking an unspoken rule of his own life. "I had no more appointments," he answered simply. Maria and Miss Perez stood quickly, the young nanny looking nervous about being caught, enjoying a relaxed moment on her first day. "Mr. Vance, this is Elena Perez," Maria introduced. "She started today." Elena gave a small nod. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir. I hope you don't mind our little outdoor activity. The babies were a bit fussy after lunch, and Sophie suggested some fresh air." Ethan realized that both Maria and Elena seemed to be expecting a reprimand. He also realized that in the past he likely would have made a critical comment about nannies who play instead of work. "It seems like a good idea," he said, surprising everyone, including himself. "The weather is pleasant." Sophie, apparently immune to the tension, grabbed his hand. "Come see, Thomas and James learned how to smile. They do it when we do it first." Ethan allowed himself to be led to where the twins sat in their strollers. Thomas and James. It felt strange to hear the names Chloe had chosen being used so naturally. He rarely even spoke them. Sophie kneeled in front of one stroller. "Look, James, look who's here." She gave the baby a big smile. "Now you do it." To Ethan's astonishment, the baby, James apparently, responded with a clumsy grin, his toothless gums exposed in pure joy. "See?" Sophie glanced at Ethan, triumphant. "Now it's your turn. Smile at Thomas." Ethan felt ridiculously self-conscious, standing in his garden being coached by a 5-year-old on how to interact with his own child. But there was something in Sophie's enthusiasm, in everyone's expectant eyes, that made him crouch down and, with conscious effort, smile at Thomas. The result was immediate, as Thomas widened his eyes, then broke into a grin as broad as his brother's. "He likes you!" Sophie exclaimed, jumping with excitement. "I told you they'd be happy when you arrived." Ethan felt a strange tightness in his chest, an intense feeling that was not entirely uncomfortable. He reached out hesitantly and touched Thomas's cheek, and the baby immediately grabbed his finger with surprising strength. "Wow, he's strong," Ethan remarked, genuinely impressed. Sophie nodded seriously. "Yeah, they're pretty strong. James almost broke my finger yesterday." Ethan found himself laughing, a strange, almost forgotten sound that came out rusty from disuse. "Maybe we should sign them up for the company wrestling team when they're older." Sophie tilted her head. "What's wrestling?" And so, almost without realizing it, Ethan found himself sitting on the blanket in the garden, explaining the basics of various sports to Sophie, while Maria and Elena exchanged surprised glances from a distance. The twins, apparently captivated by the sound of his voice, watched intently, occasionally uttering small noises of approval. It was only when the sun began to set that Maria announced dinner would be ready in an hour. "Bath time, Miss Sophie," Elena said, picking up James from his stroller. "And for these guys, too." Sophie jumped up eagerly, ready to help. Ethan watched as she and Elena headed back inside, chatting happily about which shampoo the babies preferred. "She has a special way with them," Maria commented, lingering behind with Ethan. "I've never seen the boys so calm and cheerful." Ethan stood, brushing grass from his pants. "She seems to know what she's doing," he replied, trying to sound casual. Maria hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Sophie has been asking if she can have dinner with you tonight. Usually she has her meals with the babies in the playroom, but—" "She can have dinner with me," Ethan replied quickly, realizing only after speaking that it would be the first time in years he had dined with anyone in the main dining room. Maria smiled, one of those rare smiles that reached her eyes. "I'll arrange it, sir." Dinner was a surreal experience. The massive mahogany table, designed to seat 20, had been set intimately at one end. Sophie, freshly bathed and wearing one of the new outfits Maria had bought for her, looked tiny in the oversized chair, her feet swinging above the floor. "Is this broccoli?" she asked, pointing to the vegetable on her plate. "Yes," Ethan replied, realizing he didn't know if 5-year-olds liked broccoli. "You don't like it?" Sophie shrugged. "Never tried it. Looks like a little tree." There was something so honest, so unpretentious in that observation that Ethan found himself smiling again. "That's a pretty good description. Give it a try. You might like it." To his surprise, Sophie popped a piece in her mouth without hesitation, chewed thoughtfully, and then nodded. "It's good. Kinda weird, but good." Dinner continued in this manner, punctuated by Sophie's remarks about the food, questions about why the ceiling was so high, and comments on how the babies had bathed without crying that day. "I think they were tired from playing in the garden," she explained, carefully cutting her meat with the precision of someone who had clearly been taught table manners. "Can we take them out again tomorrow?" "Maybe," Ethan replied, surprising himself yet again with his own flexibility. "If the weather's nice." Sophie beamed, satisfied. Then, suddenly, she turned serious. "Mr. Vance, can I ask you something?" Ethan felt a twinge of apprehension. Sophie's direct questions tended to unsettle him. "Sure." "Why do you look sad when you look at the babies?" The question caught Ethan so off guard that he nearly dropped his glass of water. How could a 5-year-old be so perceptive? "I don't—" He stopped, reconsidering. Lying to Sophie felt wrong somehow. "It's complicated, Sophie." "Is it because of their mom?" Ethan felt the familiar stab of pain at the thought of Chloe. But this time, something was different. It wasn't as sharp, not as paralyzing. "Yes, partly." Sophie nodded, as though that made perfect sense. "My mom died too. It hurts, right here," she said, pointing to her chest. "But looking at the babies shouldn't make you sad. They're part of her too, right? Like a present she left behind." Ethan swallowed hard, trying to control the emotion those simple words stirred in him. A present. He had never thought of the twins that way, only as painful reminders of what he had lost, not as gifts Chloe had left behind. "You're very wise for your age, Sophie," he finally managed to say. She gave a small smile. "My mom used to say that too." The rest of dinner passed in a comfortable silence, broken occasionally by Sophie's casual observations. When they finished, she yawned, clearly tired after a busy day. "I think it's bedtime for you," Ethan said, rising from the table. To his surprise, Sophie reached out her hand to him. "Could you walk me to my room? I want to see if the babies are asleep." Ethan hesitated for only a moment before taking the small hand. Together, they climbed the stairs to the bedrooms. Sophie's room was next to the twins, a setup Maria had suggested, and he had approved without much thought. They stopped first at the twins' door. Elena sat in a chair in the corner, reading a book, while the two babies slept peacefully in their cribs. "They look like angels when they're sleeping," Sophie whispered. Ethan observed their tiny, relaxed faces, their little hands clenched into fists. Angels. Yes, they truly did look like angels. Sophie yawned again, and Ethan guided her to her own room, which Maria had decorated hastily with some colorful cushions and a star-shaped lamp. "Thanks for dinner," Sophie said, climbing into bed. "That was the best broccoli I've ever had." Ethan smiled, aware that it was probably the only broccoli she had ever had. "You're welcome. Sleep well, Sophie." He was about to leave when Sophie called out, "Mr. Vance?" Ethan paused, turning to face her. "Yes?" "Tomorrow, could you try holding one of the babies? I think they'd like that." The suggestion triggered an alarm in Ethan. Holding the babies meant a level of involvement, of connection that he had been consciously avoiding. I'm not sure I'm good at that," he confessed. Sophie smiled, already half asleep. "You don't have to be good. You just have to try. They don't care if you do it right or wrong. They just want you there." With those words, she rolled over, pulling the blanket to her chin, leaving Ethan standing in the doorway, absorbing the casual wisdom of a 5-year-old. The next morning, Ethan came down to breakfast earlier than usual. Instead of hiding behind his tablet, he silently observed as Sophie helped Elena feed the twins, offering good-natured advice on how to hold the spoon at the best angle for the high chairs. When Sophie noticed him, her face lit up. "Good morning, Mr. Vance. Want to help feed James? I'm feeding Thomas." Before he could refuse, Ethan found himself sitting next to one of the twins, a bowl of baby food in hand. He looked at the baby, who stared back expectantly, then at the spoon in his hand, feeling completely lost. "Like this," Sophie demonstrated, scooping a small spoonful and making airplane noises as she guided it to Thomas's mouth. The baby obediently opened his mouth. "See? It's easy." Carefully, Ethan copied her movements, surprised when James opened his mouth eagerly, accepting the food. "That's it," Sophie exclaimed, clapping. "You're a good dad." The words struck Ethan like lightning. A good dad. That was something he had never aspired to be, something he had actively avoided. After breakfast, when Maria noted it was a nice day for a stroll, Ethan astonished everyone by saying, "I'll go with you." The shock on Maria's face was almost comical. Elena seemed momentarily lost, unsure how to handle the reclusive boss suddenly deciding to join a family outing. Sophie, of course, simply smiled and took his hand. "Great, you can push James's stroller and I'll help with Thomas." As they walked through the garden, Ethan felt strangely at peace. The discomfort that had followed him since Sophie's arrival was diminishing, replaced by something he couldn't name. On impulse, he bent down and lifted James out of the stroller, holding him awkwardly in his arms. The baby blinked in surprise, then smiled, recognizing the man who had played with him the day before. Sophie, pushing Thomas's stroller beside him, looked at the scene and smiled. "See? I told you they like you." And Ethan, holding his son for the first time in 2 years, felt something inside him thaw under the warmth of those simple words. Ethan woke to the sound of a door closing. For a moment, still in the fog of sleep, he thought he had heard Chloe returning to their room after checking on a late-night noise. The thought brought a brief moment of comfort before reality set in. Chloe was never coming back. He sat up in bed, running his hands over his face. Those moments, seconds of forgetting, followed by the renewed pain of remembering, were becoming less frequent, but they still happened, like little stabs when he least expected them. He looked at the clock, 3:12 a.m. The sound that woke him came again, not a door, but thunder. A storm had rolled in, and from the intensity of the flashes lighting his room through the curtains, it was a strong one. Ethan got up and walked to the window. He pulled aside the curtain and watched the rain pound the garden, lightning flashes turning night into day for brief seconds, revealing trees bending under the wind. It was the kind of storm Chloe had loved. She used to pull him out onto the balcony to watch nature's show, laughing when he complained about them getting soaked. "Rain won't kill us, Ethan," she would say. "But missing this, that would be a small kind of death." Ethan rested his forehead against the cold glass. After all this time, why did it still hurt so much? Why did each memory still have the power to hollow out his chest as if the air were being sucked from his lungs? Another thunderclap, closer this time, shook the house. Then another sound. Crying. No, multiple cries, coming from upstairs. The twins. Ethan hesitated. Olivia Chen, the nanny, slept in the room adjacent to the twins. Surely she would hear and take care of them. There was no need for him to interfere. But when the crying continued, becoming sharper after another booming thunder, Ethan found himself heading toward the door. He told himself he was just going to check to make sure Elena was awake. Nothing more. The hallway was dark, lit only by occasional flashes of lightning through the windows. Ethan climbed the stairs, the thick carpet muffling his steps. As he approached the twins' room, the crying got louder, but there was another sound, a small voice trying to comfort them. "Sophie." Ethan opened the nursery door slowly. The sight before him rooted him to the spot. Sophie, clad in her teddy bear pajamas, stood between the two cribs, a hand stretched out to each baby, trying to calm them despite the visible tremor in her own body every time thunder boomed. "Shh, it's okay," she was saying, her small voice competing with the storm's roar. "It's just noise. It won't hurt us, I promise." But when another lightning bolt lit up the room, followed almost immediately by a deafening thunder, Sophie let out a small yelp, flinching. The babies, sensing her fear, cried even louder. "Sophie," Ethan called softly. The girl turned, startled. Her eyes were wide, her face pale in the dim light of a moon-shaped lamp. "Mr. Vance," she exclaimed, trying to look brave despite her trembling lips. I came to see the babies because they were crying. Miss Perez took a headache pill before bed, and I think she can't hear them." Ethan entered the room, noting how Sophie tried to seem fearless, even though she was clearly terrified. "Are you afraid of storms?" he asked, moving closer. Sophie bit her lip, hesitant, as if admitting fear were an unforgivable weakness. "A little," she finally confessed. "But I'm trying to be brave so the babies won't be scared too." The simplicity of that confession struck Ethan deeply. This small girl, frightened and vulnerable, was putting the twins' comfort above her own fear, while he, an adult, had stayed in his room, expecting someone else to handle the situation. A particularly loud thunderclap rattled the house, making Sophie jump and causing the twins to scream in unison. Without thinking, Ethan stepped forward and picked up James, surprising himself with how natural the gesture felt. It's all right," he murmured, gently rocking the baby. "It's just noise, like Sophie said." Sophie looked at him with admiration, as though he were some kind of hero, then reached for Thomas, who continued crying in his crib. "Can I pick him up?" she asked, looking to Ethan as if seeking permission. Ethan hesitated. Sophie was so small, and Thomas, though still a baby, was not exactly light. "Let me help," he said, leaning down so Sophie could touch Thomas's face. "Talk to him while I hold him." Sophie stroked the baby's cheek, whispering comforting words. Thomas, recognizing his little friend, began to calm down. James, in Ethan's other arm, had already stopped crying and now gazed at his father curiously, as if memorizing every detail of his face. Another flash of lightning lit up the room, followed by thunder. Sophie shuddered, but kept talking to Thomas, determined in her mission. "I think we need a cozier place," Ethan said, surprising himself with his own words. "How about all of us sit in the big armchair?" Sophie's eyes lit up. "Can we? All together?" Ethan nodded, moving to the large rocking chair in the corner of the nursery. He sat first, still holding both babies, then helped Sophie climb up and settle beside him, partially leaning against his arm. Huddled like that, the four of them formed a strange and improbable nest. Ethan could feel the warmth of the three small bodies against him, a reassuring sensation. James clung to his finger firmly, while Thomas, now calm, was mesmerized by the buttons on Sophie's pajamas. "My mom used to tell stories during storms," Sophie said, her small voice steadier now. "She said stories were stronger than the noise out there." Ethan felt a twinge of nostalgia. Chloe had also loved stories. She had one for every occasion, every mood, every fear. "What kind of stories did she tell?" he asked, genuinely curious. Sophie smiled, a sweet and sad smile all at once. Stories about a girl who could talk to animals, and about a boy who found a secret door to another world. And, she hesitated, stories about my dad, how he'd come back someday, and we'd all be together again. The last sentence came out almost as a whisper, and Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Sophie's father, the man who had abandoned her, leaving her to wander the streets. What kind of person does that to a child? "The same kind of person you almost became," an inner voice answered. "Didn't you want to abandon your own children, emotionally?" The truth of that thought hit him hard. It was different, of course. He had provided for the twins financially, but emotionally he had been as absent as Sophie's father. "Would you like me to tell you a story?" he offered, surprised at his own suggestion. Sophie nodded eagerly, nestling closer to him. "Yes, please." Ethan took a deep breath, searching his memory for a story to share. But instead of inventing something, what emerged was the truth. "Once upon a time there was a young woman named Emma," he began, his voice softer than it had been since his wife's death. "She had hair the color of an autumn sunset and eyes that changed shades like the ocean." Sophie looked at him, immediately enthralled. "Was she your wife? The baby's mom?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, and she loved stormy days." As the rain continued to fall, Ethan told the story of how he had met Chloe in a cafe during a summer storm, how she had walked in, drenched and laughing, shaking a broken umbrella that had done her no good, how she had sat near him, the only other person in the place, and started chatting as though they were old friends. "She wasn't afraid of anything," Ethan said, a small smile emerging as he remembered. "Or at least, that's what I thought." The storm outside seemed to have lessened, or perhaps they simply didn't notice it anymore, immersed in the story. The babies dozed in Ethan's arms, but Sophie was wide awake, soaking up every word. "Was she afraid of anything?" the girl asked. Ethan thought for a moment. "She was afraid of not living enough," he finally said, "of not seeing and doing everything she wanted. And I think," he hesitated, "I think she was afraid I'd shut myself off from the world if something happened to her." Sophie regarded him with those big, wise eyes. "And did it happen? Did you shut yourself off?" The question, so direct and honest, caught Ethan by surprise. How could he explain to a 5-year-old the depth of the pain that had consumed him? How could he describe the paralyzing fear of loving again, of caring, only to lose everything once more? "Yes," he finally admitted. "For a long time, I did." Sophie nodded sympathetically, as though it were perfectly normal for an adult to confess his weaknesses to a child. "I did too," she said simply. "After my mom went away, I didn't want to talk to anyone." "You were afraid?" "Afraid of what?" Ethan asked, genuinely curious. Sophie shrugged, a small, vulnerable gesture. "Afraid of liking someone again, of trusting, and then having them go away, like Mom and Dad did." The simplicity with which Sophie described exactly what he felt left Ethan speechless. How could this tiny girl grasp what he, an adult, could barely articulate to himself? "And now?" he asked, almost afraid of her answer. "Do you still have that fear?" Sophie seemed to consider the question seriously, her small face focused. "A little," she admitted, "but I think it's worth the risk." "Worth it?" Sophie smiled, a simple, confident, childlike smile. "Yes, because if we never like anyone again, we'll always be alone, and being alone hurts more than when people leave." Ethan felt something break inside him, not painfully, but like a dam bursting, releasing waters long held back. This 5-year-old child, who had lost everything just as he had, was giving him a lesson on courage and love that no therapist or well-meaning friend had ever managed. He looked at the twins, now sleeping peacefully in his arms. James had Chloe's nose, and he realized Thomas had his lips, little pieces of her, living and breathing, growing each day. And he had almost missed all of it, hiding behind his fear and pain. "You're very wise, Sophie," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie smiled proudly. "Thanks. My mom said I was born with an old soul." Outside, the storm had subsided to a gentle rain. The room was quiet except for the soft breathing of the babies and the ticking of the wall clock. "I think they're asleep," Sophie whispered, pointing to the twins. Ethan nodded. "Let's put them back in their cribs." Gently, he stood, still holding the 2 babies. Sophie jumped from the chair and ran to straighten the blankets in the cribs, getting them ready. The ease with which they worked together, like a little improvised team, did not go unnoticed by Ethan. Once the babies were settled, Sophie yawned, reminding Ethan that it was also late for her. "Time for you to go back to bed, too," he said. Sophie nodded, but didn't move. "Mr. Vance," she asked hesitantly, "can I stay here, just until the rain stops for good?" Ethan knew the proper response would be to take her back to her room, assure her the storm was almost over, that there was nothing to fear. But looking at that small, hopeful face, he couldn't find the strength to deny such a simple request. "All right," he agreed. "You can sleep in the armchair. I'll get an extra blanket." Sophie's smile lit up her entire face. "Thank you. I promise I won't make noise." Ethan went to the closet and retrieved a soft blanket. When he returned, Sophie was already curled up in the large armchair, her short legs stretched in front of her. "Here," he said, covering her carefully. "Comfortable?" Sophie nodded, pulling the blanket up to her chin. "Very. Good night, Mr. Vance." "Good night, Sophie." Ethan turned to leave, but Sophie's voice stopped him again. "Mr. Vance?" "Yes?" "I think your wife would be happy to see you today. You were really brave." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. Chloe. Yes, she would be happy. Not because he had done the minimum, but because he had finally taken a small step out of the darkness. "Thank you, Sophie," he managed. "Sleep well." He left the door slightly ajar, a thin line of light from the hallway illuminating the path to the armchair where Sophie was already drifting off. He paused for a moment in the corridor, his heart both heavy and light at the same time. For 2 years he had lived in limbo, neither truly alive nor dead, merely existing in a fog of pain and denial, refusing to bond with his children for fear of loving and losing again, building higher and higher walls around himself, believing it was self-preservation. But now, seeing Sophie, so small, so fragile, yet so brave in her willingness to open her heart even after all she had lost, Ethan felt ashamed, and at the same time oddly hopeful. Maybe Sophie was right. Maybe the risk of loving, of caring, was smaller than the certainty of loneliness. Maybe there was a way back to the light, one step at a time. Chloe's memory would always be with him. The pain of losing her would never fully go away. But perhaps it didn't have to be a weight dragging him down, but rather a reminder that guided him, a nudge to live as she had lived, embracing every moment, every storm, every chance at joy. With one last glance at the slightly open door, Ethan made his decision. It was time to stop running away. Time to choose life, with all its risks and unpredictable beauty. It was time to begin again. Morning light streamed through the large windows of the library as Ethan reviewed the documents spread across his desk, reports from social services, temporary guardianship forms, psychological evaluations, a stack of papers trying to define in bureaucratic terms what it meant to care for a child. Almost a month had passed since Sophie had entered his life like a small tornado, upending all his carefully maintained routines and somehow filling empty spaces he hadn't realized were there. A light knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said, instinctively adjusting his tie. Maria entered, bringing a cup of coffee. "I thought you might need this, sir. Mr. Harrington called again. He said he needs to speak with you about the arrangements, as he put it." Ethan nodded, taking the cup. "Thank you, Maria. Tell him I'll return his call later." The housekeeper lingered at the door, her eyes drifting to the papers. "Is there a problem with Sophie's paperwork, sir?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair, an uncharacteristic gesture of frustration. "Bureaucracy. Apparently, when it comes to children, nothing is simple. Social services is questioning my suitability as a guardian, given my—" He paused. Recent history. What he didn't say, but they both knew, was that recent history meant his emotional absence in his own twins' lives, his prolonged grief and isolation. Maria stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind her, another sign that this was not just a routine conversation between employer and housekeeper. "If I may say so, sir, these past few days, this house has felt more like a home than it has in a very long time," she said, with the frankness that only decades of service would allow. You're more present, the twins are thriving, and as for Sophie, well, she's brought life back into these corridors. Ethan looked at Maria, noting the genuine fondness in her voice when she spoke of Sophie. It was true. The girl had won everyone over, from the cook to the gardener. Even Kevin, his usually stern driver, had been spotted helping Sophie build a race car out of cardboard boxes over the weekend. "I know, Maria, and that's exactly what worries me," Ethan admitted, surprising himself with the confession. "What if I'm not what she needs? What if this is just temporary, a whim that won't last?" Maria smiled, the kind of smile that carried the wisdom of someone who had seen much in life. "With all due respect, sir, the fact you're asking yourself that shows you genuinely care. When the twins were born, you didn't question yourself like this." The remark hit Ethan harder than he expected. It was true. When the twins were born, he hadn't worried about whether he would be a good father because he had already decided he would not be any father at all. He had outsourced that role from the start. "Sophie deserves more than just good intentions," he said finally. "Yes, she does," Maria agreed, "and it looks like she's getting exactly that." After Maria left, Ethan stayed in his study, thoughts swirling. What was he really doing? Sophie was an abandoned child who needed a stable home, a real family. Could he truly provide that, he who had failed so miserably at being a father to his own biological children? And there was another side to it. How quickly his life had changed since Sophie's arrival. Suddenly, he was involved in the daily life of the house, eating dinner at the table instead of in his study, interested in the twins' progress. There was something terrifying about how fast Sophie had torn down the barriers he had built for years. The sound of laughter from the hallway interrupted his thoughts. Sophie and Olivia Chen, probably taking the twins out for their morning walk in the garden. Ethan stood and went to the window, watching as they settled under a large tree. Olivia spread a blanket on the grass. Sophie helped with the toys, and the twins, now able to sit up more firmly, looked around with wide eyes. The scene was so normal, like a family should be. Ethan felt a sharp pang of something he identified as fear. Fear that this could be taken from him, or worse, that he would sabotage it himself, retreating into his isolation at the first sign of difficulty. The intercom on his desk beeped, pulling him back to reality. "Mr. Vance, Mr. Harrington is here," the receptionist announced. "I know he didn't have an appointment, but he insisted it was important." Ethan frowned. Robert Harrington, his lawyer of over a decade, was not one for surprise visits. "Send him in," he replied, straightening the papers on his desk. Minutes later, Robert walked into the study, immaculate in his gray suit, the kind of man born for boardrooms and courtrooms. After the usual greetings, he got straight to the point. "Alexander, we need to talk about this situation with the girl," he said, sitting in the chair opposite the desk. "I've had calls from social services. They have questions." "What kind of questions?" Ethan asked, though he already had an idea. Robert adjusted his glasses, a nervous habit that revealed his discomfort. "About your suitability as a guardian, to start with. Your recent history, your lack of involvement in raising your own children, the fact you barely know this child." He paused. "Alexander, let's be realistic. You're a busy man, running a big corporation. You're not the typical profile for an adoptive father." Though the words were spoken with apparent concern, they hit Ethan like a blow, not because they were unfair, but because they echoed the same doubts he had himself. "Sophie is fine here," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I have an excellent staff. She's adapting well. The twins adore her." "And how long will that last?" Robert interrupted, lowering his voice to a more intimate tone. "Friend to friend, Alexander. We all know what happened when you lost Emma. You just switched off. You withdrew for 2 years. And now, out of nowhere, you decide to be a father, not only to your twins, but to a little girl from the streets you barely know?" Ethan felt his face grow hot. "Sophie is not a little girl from the streets. She's a child who lost her parents and needed help I can provide." Robert raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture. Of course, and it's noble of you to want to help. But there are proper institutions for this, families who have prepared to adopt, families with mothers. The unspoken mention of Chloe hung in the air like a ghost. "What exactly are you suggesting, Robert?" Ethan asked, his voice dangerously calm. The lawyer took a deep breath. "I'm suggesting you reconsider. That maybe what's best for everyone, including the girl, is to let the system do its job. Find her a suitable family, a complete family, with experience raising children." Ethan remained silent for a long moment. Part of him, the part still living in constant fear, still trying to protect itself from emotional connections, almost agreed. It would be easier, wouldn't it? To go back to his orderly, predictable life. No mess, no uncertainty, no constant risk of failing someone who depended on him. "I asked you to prepare permanent adoption papers," he finally said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Not to find a way for me to get rid of her." Robert sighed, clearly frustrated. "Alexander, please, think with your head, not your heart. This isn't a decision that can be made in the heat of the moment. We're talking about a child's future. If you really care about her, you have to consider what's best in the long run." "And you think you know what's best?" Ethan shot back, feeling his irritation grow. "You've known Sophie for how long? 5 minutes? 10? And you've known her how long? A few weeks?" Robert shook his head. "Look, I'm not saying you don't care. It's obvious you do. But there's a big difference between offering temporary help and committing to raise a child for the rest of your life." A sharp retort was on the tip of Ethan's tongue when a small sound drew his attention, a muffled gasp coming from the slightly open door. Both men turned. The doorway was empty, but Ethan was certain of who had been there. "Sophie!" he called, quickly standing. No answer, just the faint sound of rapid footsteps hurrying away. "Damn," he muttered, rounding the desk. "Robert, we'll finish this conversation later." Without waiting for a reply, Ethan left in search of Sophie. In the corridor, he found Maria coming from the other direction. "Have you seen Sophie?" he asked, worried. "She was playing with the twins in the garden, but Elena said she came in to get a toy and never returned." "She was here," Ethan said, his concern mounting. "I think she overheard a conversation she shouldn't have. Maria, please check the upstairs rooms. I'll look around the rest of the house." As he combed the mansion, calling Sophie's name, Ethan felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The idea of Sophie hearing that conversation, hearing Robert, and by extension him, discuss her future like she was a piece of furniture to be moved around. After checking every room on the main floor with no success, Ethan headed once again to the garden. Olivia Chen sat with the twins looking anxious. "Any sign of her?" Ethan asked. The nanny shook her head. "No, sir. I searched the whole garden." She hesitated. "Sophie seemed normal this morning, happy even. I don't understand why she'd run off like this." Ethan looked at the sky, noticing dark clouds forming. A storm was coming. The thought of Sophie out there, alone, possibly scared, made his heart pound faster. "I'll check the stables," he decided. "Maria's checking the house. If she shows up, let me know immediately." The rain began just as Ethan reached the old stables, now mainly used for storage. Large drops quickly turned into a curtain of water. He hurried inside, remembering how Sophie had shown up on a rainy day, looking for shelter. The stables were empty and silent, except for the rain beating on the roof. Ethan called out for Sophie, his voice echoing in the vacant space. Nothing. He was about to leave when he noticed something, a small backpack partially hidden behind some boxes. Sophie's backpack, the one she carried the day she arrived, holding her only possessions. Ethan's blood ran cold. Sophie was not just hiding, she was planning to run away. He stepped out into the torrential rain, panic welling up. Where would she go? A 5-year-old on her own in this storm. The thought was unbearable. Then he spotted her, a small figure by the side gate, the same one Sophie had used to enter their lives. Even through the rain, he could see she was struggling with the lock, trying to open a gate far too heavy for her small arms. "Sophie!" he shouted, running toward her. The girl turned, startled. For a moment it looked as if she might flee, but then she just stood there, tiny and drenched, as Ethan approached. When he reached her, Ethan felt his heart break. Sophie was soaked, shivering from the cold, her face streaked with tears that mingled with the rain. "What are you doing?" he asked, kneeling to her level. Sophie looked away, hugging herself. "I heard what you said," she murmured, her voice almost drowned out by the rain. "That you're sending me away." Ethan felt as though he'd been punched. "Sophie, no." "It's okay," she interrupted, trying to sound brave despite her trembling voice. "I understand. You have your babies, and I'm nobody to you, so I should leave." The simplicity of those words, the resigned acceptance of someone so young at being abandoned yet again, hit Ethan like nothing before. This child, who had already lost everything, was ready to go without resistance because she believed she was not wanted. "Sophie, look at me," he said, gently placing his hands on her shoulders. "I am not sending you away. That conversation you heard, that was just Robert's opinion, not mine." Sophie finally looked at him, her big blue eyes full of doubt. "Really? Really?" Ethan drew a deep breath. "I was actually telling him I want you to stay. Permanently." Sophie frowned, confused. "What does permanently mean?" "It means forever," Ethan explained, suddenly aware of the weight of that word. Forever. A commitment he had not made to anyone since Chloe. Sophie bit her lip, still uncertain. "But that man said you're not suitable, that I need a real family, with a mom." Ethan felt a stab of pain, followed by a wave of resolve. Without thinking twice, he pulled Sophie into a hug, the first he had ever given her. He felt the small body tense at first, then gradually relax against him. "Sophie, listen to me," he said, still holding her, shielding her from the rain as best he could. "Robert doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't see how you are with the twins, how you take care of them, how you make everyone in this house smile. He doesn't understand," Ethan swallowed, surprised by the emotion in his own voice, "that you're already part of our family." Sophie pulled back slightly, looking at him with cautious hope. "Really? Really?" Ethan smiled, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "In fact, I want more than just for you to stay. I want you to be my daughter, officially. I want to adopt you, Sophie, if you want that." The girl's eyes widened, reflecting shock, hope, and an unspoken question. You want to be my dad? For real?" The simplicity of the question cut Ethan to the core. Dad, a word he had avoided for so long, a role he had rejected even when his own children were born. Now, here he was, in the pouring rain, offering to be exactly that for a girl who had appeared at his door by chance. "Yes," he answered, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "I want to be your dad, Sophie. For real." For a moment, Sophie just stared at him, as if trying to determine whether she could trust his promise. Then, slowly, a smile began to form, turning into the most radiant expression Ethan had ever seen. "I really want that," she cried, throwing her arms around his neck with such force she nearly toppled him over. Ethan hugged her back, feeling something finally click into place inside him. The rain kept pouring down around them, but neither seemed to care. "Let's go home," he finally said, lifting Sophie up, "before we catch a cold." Sophie nodded, nestling against his chest as he walked back to the mansion. When they reached the door, Maria was waiting with towels, her face a mixture of relief and worry. "Thank goodness," she exclaimed. "We were so worried. What happened?" Ethan exchanged a knowing glance with Sophie. "Just a little misunderstanding," he said, grabbing a towel and wrapping Sophie in it. "Which we've sorted out. Right, Sophie?" The girl nodded, her smile still glowing despite her chattering teeth. "Maria," Ethan continued, his voice firm, "please call Robert and tell him I need to see him tomorrow. We have adoption papers to finalize." Maria's eyes widened, then filled with tears she held back. "Yes, sir. Gladly." As Maria walked off to make the call, Sophie looked at Ethan, a small crease of worry forming between her eyebrows. "What if that man was right?" she asked quietly. "What if you change your mind later?" Ethan knelt again, looking directly into her eyes. "Sophie, I promise you, I won't change my mind. Never." He smiled. "Do you know why?" She shook her head, curious. "Because I realized something very important today." Ethan took her small hands in his. "I realized you are irreplaceable, that if I let you go, I'd be losing something I could never get back." Sophie wrinkled her nose, trying to understand. "What's irreplaceable?" "Irreplaceable," he corrected gently. "It means there's no one like you in the entire world, no one who can take your place." Sophie's face lit up with understanding. "Just like you're irreplaceable," she declared with conviction. "For me, even if you're not my real dad by blood?" Ethan felt a knot in his throat. "Family isn't just about blood, Sophie. It's about choice, and I choose you, from now on and forever." He held out his hand. "Deal?" Sophie placed her small hand in his, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so little. "Deal." In that moment, looking at this brave child who had wormed her way into his heart through all the barriers he had built, Ethan knew he would never be the same. The inner struggle, his fear of loving again, of committing, of risking the pain of loss, had not completely vanished. Perhaps it never would. But now, for the first time in a long time, fear was not in control. The decision had been made, not out of impulse or pity, but from something much deeper, the absolute certainty that Sophie, this little girl who had come to his house seeking shelter, had become essential to his life, as essential as the air he breathed. And as surely as the rain falling outside, Alexander Bennett knew he had finally found his way back home. The adoption process moved forward, but not as quickly as Ethan would have liked. There were interviews, home visits, psychological evaluations, an entire bureaucracy that, while necessary, tested his patience. He wanted Sophie to feel secure, to know without a doubt this was her permanent home. But Ethan noticed, in small moments, that Sophie still lived with one foot in uncertainty. Subtle details like how she would tuck crumbs of bread into her pockets after meals, how she meticulously folded each new piece of clothing as though she might have to leave at any moment, how she sometimes woke in the night to check on the twins as if afraid they might all vanish while she slept. One Saturday morning, as they had breakfast in the garden, a new family ritual Ethan surprisingly loved, he noticed Sophie pushing food around her plate, lost in thought. "Everything okay, Sophie?" he asked gently. "Not hungry?" She looked up, startled. "I am," she answered quickly, shoving a large bite of pancake into her mouth as if to prove her point. Ethan smiled, but he could see something in her eyes, a shadow, an unasked question. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" he offered. Sophie chewed slowly, as if stalling for time to decide whether to speak. Finally, after swallowing, she took a deep breath. "When am I going to have to leave?" The question hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. After weeks of progress, of family moments, of shared laughter, she still expected to be sent away. "Sophie, you're not leaving," he said firmly. "We're in the middle of the adoption process, remember? You're staying here forever." She looked at him with those big eyes that held a sadness too deep for her age. "But what if it doesn't work out? The social worker asked a lot of questions last time. She didn't seem to like you very much." Ethan tried not to show his own concern. Mr. Olson, the social worker assigned to the case, was indeed strict, asking probing questions about his past, about how he had treated the twins, about his ability to raise children as a single, busy businessman. "Mr. Olson is just doing his job," he explained, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "He has to make sure I'll be a good dad to you." Sophie bit her lip, hesitating. What if my other dad comes back, my real one?" Another blow. Her real dad, as though Ethan, despite all his efforts, was still just a temporary stand-in. "Sophie, we talked about this. Your biological father, He paused, choosing his words carefully. He hasn't come looking for you this whole time, and even if he did now, legally? But what if he's just lost? Sophie interrupted, a sudden hope lighting her face. Or maybe he's sick in some hospital and can't find me. Mom always said he'd come back one day. Ethan felt his heart tighten. It was not the first time Sophie had mentioned this possibility, that her father had not abandoned her on purpose, but simply could not return. It was a fantasy she clung to, fueled by her mother's stories, likely intended to shield her from the painful truth. "Sophie," he began, unsure how to continue. "How do you tell a child her hopes are probably in vain, that the man who should have loved and protected her had chosen to vanish?" Fortunately, or maybe not, they were interrupted by the twins, who started fussing in their high chairs, demanding attention. The moment passed, but Ethan could not forget Sophie's question or the fragile hope in her eyes. That afternoon, after leaving Sophie to help Olivia with the twins, Ethan locked himself in his office and made a call he had been avoiding for weeks. "Jessica, Ethan Vance, I need you to do something for me." A week later, Ethan was again in his study, but this time he was not alone. Jessica Grant sat opposite him, a thin folder resting on the desk between them. "Are you sure you want to do this, Ethan?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. "Sometimes certain stones are best left unturned." Ethan looked at the closed folder, feeling a mix of apprehension and resolve. "I need to know, Jessica. Sophie still believes he'll come back. It's affecting how she sees the future, how she sees the adoption, how she sees me." Jessica sighed, sliding the folder toward Ethan. "All right, then. Honestly, it wasn't hard to find him. Ryan Peterson, 38 years old, works as a mechanic about 50 miles away." Ethan felt his chest tighten. So close. Sophie's father had been so close all this time. Does he know? About Sophie? About what happened to her mother? Jessica nodded grimly. "Yes, I spoke to him in person, as you requested. Explained that I represent the potential guardian of his daughter and wanted to clarify the legal situation." She paused, uneasy. Ethan, he showed no interest. In fact, he got quite angry about the approach, said, and I'm quoting, "That girl is not my problem. I never wanted to be a father. I told Laura that already." Ethan felt anger well up inside him. Laura must have been Sophie's mother, the woman who had died leaving a young daughter alone in the world. He knew Sophie's mother died? That Sophie was alone? Jessica looked away. Yes, apparently a neighbor contacted him after Laura's death. He just didn't care. Ethan stood abruptly, unable to remain seated while processing this information. This man, Ryan Peterson, had not only abandoned Sophie, but had deliberately chosen to ignore her suffering, leaving her to fend for herself on the streets. "Anything else?" Ethan asked, barely containing his anger. "He has another family now. Got married about 2 years ago. They have a young son." The revelation was like a punch to the gut. A son. Ryan Peterson had another child, one he apparently chose to love and raise while abandoning Sophie. "He doesn't want any contact, any relationship with Sophie at all?" Jessica shook her head. "In fact, he was very clear about that. He signed a formal waiver of parental rights when I presented the option." She pointed to a document in the folder. "It actually makes your adoption process much easier. No need to seek his approval in court." Ethan picked up the document, looking at the careless scrawl at the bottom. How could anyone renounce a child so easily? Sophie, with her contagious laugh, her kindness toward his twins, her bravery in the face of adversity. How could anyone not want her in their life? "Thank you, Jessica," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I know you had your doubts about this adoption, but—" Jessica raised a hand to stop him. "I was wrong, Ethan," she smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "Seeing you now, so protective, so determined to do the right thing for this girl, well, let's just say my professional opinion has changed drastically." After Jessica left, Ethan stayed in his study for hours, rereading the report, staring at the photo of Ryan Peterson attached to the documents. The man looked nothing like Sophie, except maybe the shape of his chin. There was nothing in his ordinary face suggesting the extraordinary child he had helped create. The question now was what to do with this information. Did Sophie deserve to know the truth about her biological father? Or would it be kinder to shield her from such a painful reality, letting her keep the illusion of a father who loved her but was unable to return? Ethan could not decide which was worse, a comforting lie or a cruel truth. In the days that followed, Ethan watched Sophie even more closely. He noticed how she occasionally gazed out the window with a distant look, as though expecting someone to arrive. How she sometimes asked Maria or Olivia if there had been any phone calls or letters for her. Each of those little moments felt like a knife to his heart. Sophie was living in limbo, unable to fully embrace her present because she was clinging to the hope of a past that never really existed. One evening, after tucking Sophie into bed, Ethan lingered in her doorway, watching her. She had hung drawings on the walls, portraits of the family they were building, Ethan, the twins, Olivia, Maria, even Kevin the driver. But in one corner, almost hidden, there was another drawing. A single figure, a man with a big smile, labeled "My Dad" in childish letters. At that moment, Ethan made his decision. However painful it would be, Sophie deserved to know the truth. Not all at once, perhaps, and not cruelly, but she needed to be freed from the endless waiting, the hope that prevented her from accepting the love right in front of her. The next day, a Saturday, Ethan canceled all his appointments and invited Sophie on a special outing, just the two of them. Olivia would stay with the twins, and they would spend the day together, doing whatever Sophie wanted. The girl lit up at the suggestion. "Can we go to the zoo?" she asked, practically jumping with excitement. "I want to see the elephants." Ethan smiled, feeling that now familiar surge of affection Sophie always inspired. The zoo it is. The day at the zoo was perfect in many ways. Sophie ran from one enclosure to another, wide-eyed at each animal. Ethan followed her patiently, answering her endless questions, buying cotton candy when she asked, carrying her on his shoulders when her little feet got tired. To any onlooker, they looked like a father and daughter enjoying a day out, and in many ways that was exactly what they were. After lunch, they sat on a bench by the duck pond. Sophie was licking an ice cream, her legs swinging, too short to reach the ground. "This is the best day ever," she declared, ice cream dripping down her chin. Ethan smiled, wiping her chin with a napkin. "Better than the day we went to the amusement park?" Sophie considered seriously. Almost the same. They had roller coasters there, but here they have elephants. It's hard to choose." Ethan chuckled, but then grew serious, steeling himself for what he needed to do. "Sophie, there's something we need to talk about." She must have noticed the change in his tone because she stopped licking her ice cream and looked at him with cautious eyes. "Is it bad?" "Not exactly bad," he answered carefully, choosing his words. "But it's important. About your father. Your biological father." Sophie's eyes grew wide, a mix of hope and fear. "You found him? Is he coming back?" Ethan took a deep breath. This was it. There was no way to soften the blow entirely, but he could at least ensure Sophie knew she was loved no matter what. "Sophie, remember when you told me how your mom said your dad would come back someday, that maybe he was just lost or sick?" She nodded slowly. "Well, recently I hired some people to try to find him, to find out what happened. And they did find him." Sophie's face briefly lit up, but something in Ethan's expression made her tone down her excitement. "Is he okay?" she asked in a small voice. Ethan nodded. "Yes, he's fine. His name is Daniel. He works fixing cars." He paused, uncertain how to continue. Sophie waited, her eyes never leaving his face. "Sophie, there's something you need to understand. Sometimes they make hard choices. Sometimes they can't be who they're supposed to be or do what's right." Sophie frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean? He can't come see me?" Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he took Sophie's small hands in his own. "Sophie, your dad knows where you are. He knows about me, about the adoption. And Ethan hesitated, but forced himself to continue. He decided he doesn't want to be part of your life." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie's face went through a range of emotions so rapidly that Ethan could barely keep up. Confusion, shock, hurt, and finally, a sad understanding. "He doesn't want me?" The question was so soft Ethan almost didn't hear it. "Sophie, this has nothing to do with you," he rushed to say. "Nothing at all. Some people just don't know how to love, how to care. That's his problem, not yours." Tears began rolling down Sophie's cheeks, silently at first, then accompanied by small sobs that broke Ethan's heart. "But Mom said, she said he'd come back, that he loved me." Ethan pulled Sophie close as she cried. "Your mom wanted to protect you. She wanted you to feel loved. And you are, Sophie, so loved." Sophie cried for a long time, her little body shaking with sobs. Ethan just held her, letting her pour out all the pain, all the disappointment, all the destroyed hopes she had carried. When her sobs finally subsided, Sophie remained huddled against him, clinging to his shirt as if afraid he, too, might disappear. "Do you want to talk about it?" Ethan asked gently. "Or ask anything?" Sophie took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Does he have other kids?" The question was so quiet Ethan almost asked her to repeat it. He hesitated. Would it be too cruel to tell her the truth that Daniel had chosen another child over her? But looking at her determined little face, he knew Sophie deserved honesty. "Yes," he replied simply. "He does." Sophie absorbed the information, her face reflecting a pain no child should feel. "So he just didn't want me," she concluded, her emphasis revealing the depth of rejection she felt. "Sophie, look at me," Ethan urged, waiting until she raised her eyes. "What your father did, his choices, they don't define who you are. And they definitely don't determine how worthy you are of being loved. Understand?" Sophie did not look entirely convinced, but nodded. "I know this hurts right now," Ethan continued, "and it's okay to be sad, to be angry. Those feelings are normal, but I want you to know that none of this changes how much I want you in my life, how much the twins need you, how much Maria, Olivia, all of us love you." Sophie gazed at him, her eyes red but now filled with curiosity. "Even after the adoption is finished, you'll still want me?" The question took Ethan by surprise. "Sophie, an adoption doesn't finish. Once it's official, you'll be my daughter forever, no matter what. Even if I do something bad? Even if you do something bad? Even if I break expensive stuff?" Ethan chuckled. "Even if you break expensive stuff?" Sophie seemed to process this, her little face serious. "And if you have other kids? Real kids that look like you?" Ethan's heart clenched. Real kids. How to explain to a 5-year-old that blood was not what made a family? "Sophie, you are my real kid. James and Thomas are my real kids, and any other child who might join our lives someday would also be my real child. It's not blood that makes a family. It's love." He paused, then spoke softly. "You know, animals do that too. Many species adopt babies that aren't biologically theirs. They love and protect them as if they were their own, because in the end, that's what matters, loving and protecting each other." Sophie considered this, seemingly finding comfort in it. "So you really want me forever?" Ethan smiled, feeling his eyes grow damp. "Sophie Bennett, I want you in my life forever. You're the daughter I never knew I needed until you showed up at my door." Sophie gave one last shaky sob, then, to Ethan's surprise, threw her arms around his neck, hugging him with all the strength her little body could muster. "You want me. That's what matters," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Ethan hugged her back, feeling something inside him heal, a wound he hadn't realized he still carried. "Yes, Sophie, that's exactly what matters." 3 months later, Ethan stood in the courtroom, Sophie by his side, wearing a new blue dress for the occasion. The twins, now bigger and bubbling with energy, were in Olivia's and Maria's arms, sporting tiny suits that made them look like miniature gentlemen. The judge peered over his glasses, a kindly smile on his aging face. "Well, it appears all the paperwork is in order," he announced. "The biological father's waiver of rights has been duly recorded, and all the social services reports are highly positive." He looked directly at Sophie. "Young lady, do you understand what's happening today?" Sophie, who had rehearsed this moment for weeks, straightened her shoulders and answered clearly, "Yes, sir. Today, I'll officially become a Bennett forever." The judge smiled more broadly. "Exactly. And are you happy about that?" Sophie glanced at Ethan, then at the twins, at Maria and Olivia, and finally back to the judge. "Happier than I've ever been in my whole life," she replied, with a sincerity that made everyone in the room smile. "And you, Mr. Vance?" the judge asked, turning to Ethan. "Are you prepared to assume full parental responsibilities for Sophie, to love, protect, and guide her in the years to come?" Ethan placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, feeling a wave of certainty entirely new to him, not the certainty of business deals or financial strategies, but a certainty of the heart. "I'm more than prepared, Your Honor. In fact, I've felt like this incredible girl's father for a long time now. Today, we're just making official what we already know in our hearts." The judge nodded, satisfied. "Then, by the power vested in me by the state, I am pleased to declare this adoption officially finalized." He tapped his gavel lightly. "Sophie Torres is now legally and permanently Sophie Bennett." Applause filled the small courtroom. Maria openly wept. Olivia tried to keep her composure while holding James, who was quite interested in the judge's gavel. Jessica, seated in the front row, clapped with a genuine smile. Even Mr. Olson, the strict social worker, looked moved. Sophie, radiant, tugged on Ethan's sleeve until he knelt down. "Now I'm really your daughter," she whispered, as if sharing a secret. Ethan smiled, hugging her. "You always were, Sophie, from the moment you walked through that door. The paperwork just confirms what we already knew." Months later, the Vance residence was unrecognizable to anyone who had known it before. The heavy drapes that once blocked out the light had been replaced by cheerful, airy fabrics chosen by Sophie. Laughter echoed through the hallways. The garden, once meticulously manicured but rarely used, now showed signs of constant activity. A newly built treehouse, a small swing set, flower beds Sophie helped to plant. Ethan, who once spent most of his time in his study, was now more often found on the living room floor, building block towers with the twins, or in the kitchen, learning to make pancakes with Maria and Sophie. His company had not suffered from this shift in priorities. If anything, he had become a better leader, more empathetic, more willing to delegate and trust his team. The endless hours at the office, once an escape from loneliness, were no longer needed. One Sunday afternoon, as he watched Sophie teach the twins, now nearly 3, how to play tag in the garden, Ethan found himself thinking of Chloe. Not with the paralyzing grief of before, but with a sweet, bittersweet longing. "You'd love her, Chloe," he murmured to himself. "Our daughter, our brave girl." Noticing him standing alone, Sophie ran over. "Dad, come play with us. Thomas is almost able to catch you all by himself." "Dad." The word still made his chest tighten every time Sophie said it, a constant reminder of the extraordinary journey they had taken. "I'm coming," he replied, smiling as he ran across the lawn, pretending he could not escape the little hands of the twins. Sophie, laughing, leading the attack. Ethan Vance realized a simple but profound truth. Love was not a weakness, as he had once feared. It was not too big a risk, nor a dangerous vulnerability. Love, the very thing that now filled his home and his heart, was in fact the greatest strength there was. It had saved Sophie from the streets, brought the twins back to life, and in the end, saved Ethan himself from the prison of isolation he had built. And as Sophie leapt onto his back in victory, and the twins clung to his legs, shrieking with delight, Ethan Vance knew with absolute certainty that his family, this extraordinary, imperfect, and utterly his family, was complete.